What if the most dangerous battlefield in America was not overseas, but rolling silently through the heartland at midnight? At 11:42 p.m., somewhere between Oklahoma City and Little Rock Interstate, 40 cut through darkness like a vein of steel. Headlights flowed east. Engines hummed. An Arkansas state trooper eased out from the median and pulled in behind a long-haul truck bearing a trusted corporate logo once seen on highways from coast to coast. The stop looked routine. The driver complied. Paperwork was clean. The cargo manifest listed industrial machinery bound for Atlanta. Nothing about the scene suggested a national security breach. And yet, in that quiet moment on the shoulder, America's hidden war revealed itself. A portable density scanner told a different story. Steel parts should weigh more. 400 pounds were missing. Inspectors drilled a precise hole into the trailer wall and struck a hollow void. Panels peeled back. Inside, stacked with industrial precision, sat hundreds of kilograms of cocaine wrapped, stamped, and ready for distribution. Street value millions. The driver did not panic. He did not deny. He looked relieved. He said he was following orders, not from a dispatcher, from a cartel. That single stop shattered a comforting illusion that borders define threats, and that danger announces itself loudly. Instead, the threat had blended in, hidden in plain sight, moving legally insured and trusted. For years, American highways had functioned as covert corridors, carrying poison alongside consumer goods shielded by the legitimacy of corporate logistics. This was not smuggling by night boats or desert crossings. This was organized crime wearing a suit, using spreadsheets, compliance departments, and routing software. Investigators soon understood the scale. The truck was not an outlier. It was a node. The driver was not a rogue. He was one of dozens. The company logo was not a coincidence. It was camouflage. What appeared to be a routine safety stop had punctured the surface of a systemized operation that treated the U.S. transportation network as strategic infrastructure to be captured and weaponized. This realization reframed the problem facing federal authorities. Drug trafficking was no longer just a law enforcement issue measured in seizures and arrests. It had become an intelligence challenge, one involving corporate acquisition, shell companies, and long-term infiltration. The highways themselves were the terrain, freight schedules were the timelines, warehouses were forward operating bases, and the victims were not abstract. They were communities downstream of addiction and workers unknowingly standing inside a criminal enterprise. The case would eventually draw in the Federal Bureau of Investigation and expose a direct line to the Sinaloa Cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. But in that first hour, none of that was visible. There was only a dark highway, a compliant driver, and a hidden compartment that told a terrifying truth: America's supply chain had been compromised. If a cartel could move industrial quantities of narcotics through legitimate freight without detection, what else could pass unnoticed? And how many more trucks were already rolling east? The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the picture became, and the more disturbing it looked. This was not a case of bribed drivers slipping contraband past inspections. It was a hostile takeover executed with patience, capital, and strategic discipline. Financial records showed that in 2022, the trucking company had been purchased for roughly $850 million by an investment group presenting itself as a routine private equity firm. The transaction barely raised eyebrows. Mergers of that size happen every year. Jobs were preserved. Operations continued. Regulators saw nothing unusual. That was the point. Behind the clean paperwork sat a shell structure designed to disappear under scrutiny. Layers of offshore accounts, nominee directors, and U.S. registered holding firms created the illusion of legitimacy. According to federal investigators, the purchase funds were not venture capital or institutional financing. They were laundered narcotics proceeds, recycled drug money converted into ownership of American infrastructure. For the cartel, this was not an expense. It was an investment. Once control was secured, the transformation was subtle. No sweeping changes, no mass firings. Instead, key positions were quietly replaced. Warehouse supervisors, route planners, a handful of senior managers with access to compliance systems and internal audits. The goal was not to disrupt the company, but to hollow it out from the inside, turning a logistics giant into a precision delivery system for illicit cargo. The operational logic was ruthless. Drugs crossed the southern border using established trafficking channels, then converged at a major logistics hub near El Paso. From there, narcotics were loaded into modified trailers alongside legitimate freight. These were not crude alterations. Investigators later described hidden compartments engineered with hydraulic systems, reinforced panels, and magnetic locking mechanisms, designs intended to defeat standard roadside inspections. Only a specific activation sequence could reveal the voids. To inspect inspectors, the trucks looked factory standard. Drivers were selected carefully. Federal affidavits described 89 individuals spread across the network, some coerced, others financially compromised, a few fully committed. They drove normal routes to distribution hubs in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, and Memphis. Dispatch logs showed nothing irregular. Delivery times were consistent. Fuel usage matched expectations. For years, the system ran undetected, moving an estimated hundreds of tons of cocaine and methamphetamine across state lines. What made the scheme especially dangerous was its scale and patience. This was not smash and grab crime. It was corporate strategy applied to trafficking. The cartel understood that legitimacy is the strongest shield. A trusted brand rolling down an American highway is rarely questioned. That trust became a weapon. By the time analysts pieced together the acquisition trail, the implications reached far beyond narcotics. If a criminal organization could buy its way into a critical transportation artery, what stopped similar actors from targeting ports, rail hubs, or data centers? The case exposed a regulatory blind spot. Private capital could quietly acquire strategic assets with minimal transparency, even under heightened national security concerns. As the evidence mounted, authorities faced a dilemma. Move too early and the network would vanish. Records wiped, assets dissolved. Wait too long and the damage would continue. The decision was made to do something unprecedented, dismantle the entire structure in one synchronized strike. But coordinating such a move across a continent-wide logistics network posed a question few agencies had ever faced. How do you arrest dozens of drivers who never stop moving and seize a criminal empire without tipping it off? The plan that emerged was as ambitious as the threat itself. Federal authorities understood that this was not a case that could be dismantled piece by piece. One missed signal, one premature arrest, and the network would evaporate. Records would be shredded, drivers would vanish, shell companies would fold overnight. To succeed, the entire structure had to be frozen in place and taken down at once. The operation was given a name that reflected both its scale and intent: Rolling Thunder. For weeks, agents worked in near total silence. Subpoenas quietly pulled years of shipping data, allowing analysts to map routes and identify subtle anomalies. Trucks that made unexplained detours, trailers that spent too long at certain facilities, delivery patterns that did not match legitimate freight flows. Court-authorized GPS trackers were installed on vehicles linked to the suspected 89 drivers. Surveillance teams observed warehouses where trucks arrived full and departed lighter, even though no corresponding commercial deliveries were logged. By early summer 2025, a national map emerged. 23 warehouses across 14 states functioned as distribution and processing hubs. Some were officially listed as automotive or industrial facilities. Others were nondescript storage depots near rail lines and interstates. Each location was tied to the same corporate parent, the same routing software, the same financial channels. The network was no longer theoretical. It was visible in real time. The logistical challenge was immense. Drivers slept in cabs, crossed state lines daily, and rarely stopped for long. Warehouses operated around the clock. Coordinating raids across multiple jurisdictions meant aligning federal agencies, state police, and local authorities down to the minute. Timing was everything. The arrest had to occur while the trucks were loaded, the warehouses active, and the records intact. At 5 a.m. Eastern Time on July 15th, the order went out. Across 18 states, surveillance teams shifted from observation to action on highways, unmarked vehicles, boxed and target trucks during what appeared to be routine traffic stops. In diners and truck stops, agents moved through crowded rooms to detain drivers mid-conversation before encrypted phones could be activated. In Texas, convoys of semis were intercepted simultaneously, their drivers pulled from cabs as tactical teams secured the scene. At the warehouses, the entries were decisive. Federal teams breached doors to find industrial-scale operations underway. In Illinois, agents stormed a facility listed as an automotive parts hub and discovered workers extracting methamphetamine from hollowed-out machinery, chemical dust hanging in the air. Legitimate freight sat untouched in corners, while narcotics took priority on the floor. Elsewhere, K9 units alerted on trailers as density scanners pinpointed voids behind fiberglass walls. By mid-morning, the scope of the takedown became clear. Tons of cocaine, tons of methamphetamine, large quantities of fentanyl, millions in cash. Every targeted driver was in custody. Every identified warehouse was secured. At corporate headquarters, executives who had facilitated the takeover were arrested as servers were seized and ledgers copied. For the first time, the full financial architecture of the operation lay exposed. It was the largest coordinated corporate takedown in American history, yet even as officials tallied seizures and arrests, another reality was setting in. This was not a hollow shell company collapsing in isolation. It was a functioning logistics giant with real customers, real employees, and deep integration into national supply chains. Removing it overnight would have consequences far beyond the courtroom. The question was no longer whether the operation succeeded, it was what the country would feel next, and whether victory against the cartel would come at a price the public was prepared to pay. As engineers and analysts began dismantling the seized fleet, the true sophistication of the operation came into focus. This was not improvised concealment, it was applied engineering. Federal technical teams documented hidden compartments integrated directly into trailer frames, fuel tanks reshaped to preserve external dimensions, and hydraulic floor systems that could lift or seal compartments with the push of a concealed switch. Some voids were accessible only through magnetic key sequences known to a single handler. To routine inspection, the trucks were indistinguishable from factory models. This level of modification explained how the network survived for years. Standard weigh stations rely on paperwork, gross weight, and visual checks. The cartel had engineered around every one of those safeguards. Weight discrepancies were minimized by redistributing legitimate cargo. Materials used in the compartments mimicked the density of industrial insulation. Even trained inspectors would have needed time tools and suspicion to uncover the truth. In an industry built on speed and trust, that suspicion rarely existed. The logistics planning was equally advanced. Routes were selected not just for efficiency, but for enforcement fatigue. Trucks avoided repeated crossings at the same inspection points. Drivers rotated schedules to prevent pattern recognition. Warehouses were placed near interstates and rail hubs to blend into existing freight ecosystems. From a systems perspective, the cartel had created a parallel supply chain riding on top of the legal one. Investigators concluded that this was not simply about moving drugs, it was about control. By owning the carrier, the cartel eliminated intermediaries, reduced risk, and increased margins. It could move product at industrial scale timed to market demand, insulated from traditional interdiction methods. In effect, narcotics trafficking had evolved into a vertically integrated enterprise. But the same integration that protected the operation also magnified its collapse. Once authorities seized the fleet and froze accounts, the shock rippled outward. Automotive plants in the Midwest reported assembly delays as parts sat in impounded trailers. Retail distribution centers in the South missed delivery windows. Perishable goods spoiled. What had been a criminal artery was also a commercial one, and severing it triggered cascading failures. Inside the company, confusion turned to panic. Thousands of employees, mechanics, dispatchers, clerks, legitimate drivers learned through news alerts that the firm they worked for was now the center of a federal case. Many had no knowledge of the illicit activity. Their paychecks had been clean, their roots ordinary, yet their livelihoods were tied to an enterprise that no longer existed. When the company filed for bankruptcy, pensions vanished, healthcare coverage evaporated, entire communities felt the impact. This was the paradox facing policymakers. The operation saved lives by removing massive quantities of narcotics from circulation. At the same time, it demonstrated how deeply criminal capital had embedded itself into the legal economy. The cartel had used American workers as camouflage, knowing that dismantling the operation would inevitably harm innocents. As the dust settled, officials confronted an uncomfortable truth. Law enforcement had won a decisive battle, but the structure that allowed such an infiltration, opaque corporate acquisitions, minimal vetting of strategic industries, and an economy built on speed over scrutiny remained largely intact. The question hanging over Washington was stark. Had this been a rare anomaly or a warning shot? And if the latter, how many other critical systems were already compromised, quietly doing business as usual? By the next morning, the human cost of the takedown could no longer be ignored. Court documents detailed the scale of the criminal enterprise, but outside the federal buildings, a different story unfolded. More than 7,000 legitimate employees woke up to uncertainty. Dispatchers who had routed trucks for years, mechanics who had kept fleets running through winter nights, office staff who had never set foot near a warehouse floor. None had trafficked drugs, none had seen the hidden compartments. Yet all were suddenly unemployed, their futures collateral damage in a war they never knew they were part of. Communities felt the shock immediately. In logistics-dependent regions, local economies slowed overnight. Truck stops lost regular customers. Small suppliers went unpaid. Families who had relied on steady union wages faced abrupt gaps in income and healthcare. The narrative of victory tons seized, drivers arrested, clashed with scenes of ordinary workers lining up for assistance, stunned that a respected American company had been hollowed out without their knowledge. In Washington, the political ramifications were swift. Under President Donald Trump, the administration framed the operation as proof that transnational cartels now represented a core national security threat, not just a criminal nuisance. Officials argued that the case exposed a vulnerability on par with cyber intrusions or foreign espionage, the quiet capture of critical infrastructure through financial means. Congressional hearings followed, focusing less on narcotics and more on governance failures. One question dominated those sessions: how had a private equity-style acquisition of a major transportation firm occurred without meaningful scrutiny of the capital behind it? The answer was uncomfortable. Existing regulations emphasized market efficiency and competition, not national resilience. As long as paperwork appeared compliant, the origin of funds often went unquestioned unless a specific red flag emerged. In this case, the red flags were buried deliberately. Legislators moved quickly. Draft bills proposed mandatory transparency for acquisitions involving transportation ports, energy, and data logistics. A new interagency task force was announced to audit ownership structures across sectors considered vital to economic continuity. Intelligence briefings suggested the problem was not isolated. Criminal and hostile actors alike had learned that buying influence could be safer than smuggling it. At the same time, early indicators showed tangible impact on the drug trade. Federal assessments reported a sharp decline in interstate trafficking via commercial trucks in the months following the raids. Prices rose. Distribution networks scrambled. The cartel had lost not just inventory, but its most efficient delivery platform. Nearly $1 billion invested over years had been dismantled in a single morning. Yet the long-term question lingered. Criminal enterprises adapt, routes shift, methods evolve. The highways would not remain quiet forever. What mattered now was whether the United States would treat this case as an exception or as a blueprint for reform. Because if legitimacy can be weaponized and trust exploited at scale, then the line between commerce and conflict becomes dangerously thin, and the next threat may already be moving unnoticed under a familiar logo. By late summer, the empty headquarters building stood as a symbol of a deeper reckoning. Its signage, removed servers, seized accounts frozen. It represented more than the collapse of a criminal front. It marked the moment when America was forced to confront how power now moves quietly, legally, and often invisibly. This was not a failure of bravery or effort by law enforcement. It was a failure of systems built for speed, profit, and trust in a world where adversaries exploit those very values. The strategic lesson was stark. Cartels no longer needed to fight the state head-on. They could buy around it. By embedding themselves inside legitimate commerce, they reduced risk and increased leverage. The highways became neutral ground only in appearance. In reality, they were contested space where criminal capital competed with public authority for control of movement, timing, and access. This blurred line between crime and national security challenged traditional assumptions about borders enforcement and sovereignty. Officials emphasized that the success of the takedown came from coordination, intelligence sharing across agencies, real-time data integration, and the willingness to treat economic infrastructure as a security asset. Yet success also exposed fragility. If one logistics firm could be captured so thoroughly, the question was not whether others existed, but where. Ports, rail yards, warehousing software, even insurance and compliance layers. The attack surface was wide and incentives favored opacity. The balance between security and freedom now came into focus. Tighter vetting of acquisitions could slow investment. Deeper inspections could disrupt commerce. Transparency could clash with privacy and market norms. But the alternative, unchecked infiltration carried its own costs: addiction, corruption, and the erosion of trust in institutions that bind a nation together. The choice was no longer abstract. As prosecutions moved forward, sentences were severe. Drivers faced decades. Executives faced life. The message was clear: legitimacy would not shield criminality. Yet deterrence alone was not enough. The administration signaled a broader shift, treating supply chain security as a pillar of national defense alongside cyber and energy resilience. The goal was prevention, not just punishment. The highways are quieter now, trucks still roll, commerce continues, but the illusion has been shattered. Threats do not always arrive by force. Sometimes they arrive by invoice acquisition and compliance report approved, stamped, and waved through. The question that remains is urgent and unresolved in an era where power can purchase trust. Will America adapt its defenses fast enough, or will the next warning come from another routine stop on a dark road? This investigation revealed how transnational cartels evolved from traffickers into strategic infiltrators of American infrastructure. By acquiring a major logistics firm through laundered capital, criminals transformed trusted highways into covert supply lines, moving industrial quantities of narcotics under the cover of legitimacy. The nationwide takedown succeeded because authorities treated commerce as contested space, coordinating intelligence, timing arrests precisely, and dismantling the entire structure at once. Yet the victory carried consequences. Thousands of innocent workers lost jobs. Supply chains stalled. The case exposed regulatory blind spots that prioritized market efficiency over national resilience. In response, Washington moved towards stricter transparency for acquisitions in critical sectors and reframed cartel activity as a national security threat. The broader lesson is clear: security and freedom are no longer separate domains. When trust becomes a weapon, defenses must evolve beyond borders and patrols to include ownership, finance, and governance. The highways still connect the nation, but vigilance must now extend to who controls them, how they are financed, and what moves beneath familiar logos.